The year is 1955. You're standing in Paris under the vaulted glass ceiling of the Grand Palais Exhibition Hall, surrounded by the greatest cars Europe has to offer. Chrome bumpers everywhere, tail fins catching the light, upright windshields and boxy bodies in every direction. And then the covers come off one car in the corner of the room, and within 15 minutes, 743 people have tried to buy it. By end of day, 12,000 deposits. By the time the show closes, 80,000 people have put their name on a list. That record stood for 60 years. Until a company called Tesla, armed with the internet, social media, and a global reservation system, finally broke it. Citroen broke it with clerks, typewriters, and ringing telephones. The car was called the DS, and depending on whether your local mechanic had ever seen one before, that name was either a promise or a warning. This is Motorsport Heritage, and I spend way too much time thinking about the cars that changed everything and never got the credit they deserved. If you're someone who loves the stories behind the machines, the engineering decisions, the political drama, the moments where one car somehow altered the course of history, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, before we go any further, here's the thing most people get wrong about the DS. They talk about it like it's a curiosity, a quirky French experiment that looked incredible and broke down constantly. A kind of beautiful disaster. And look, that framing is not entirely unfair. The early cars did leak. They did confound mechanics. They did sink to the ground when you parked them for too long. But that framing misses something enormous. Because the Citroen DS was not just a weird car. It was the most technologically advanced production automobile ever built to that point in human history. Full stop. And depending on which features you're counting, it remained the most advanced production car on the road for a decade after it launched. In some respects, it held that position for 2 decades. That is not a curiosity. That is a cathedral on wheels. And to understand why someone built a cathedral when everyone else was building garden sheds, you have to go back much further than 1955. You have to go back to 1934. That was the year Citroën launched the traction Avant, the world's first mass-produced front-wheel drive car with a unitary body, meaning no separate chassis, just a single welded steel structure carrying everything. It also had independent front suspension, rack and pinion steering, and 4-wheel hydraulic drum brakes. Every single one of those features was revolutionary in 1934. Taken together, they were almost incomprehensibly advanced. The problem was that being first is expensive. Catastrophically expensive. The traction Avant bankrupted the company. André Citroën, the founder, lost everything and died a year later, in 1935, before he could see whether his gamble had paid off. It had. The traction Avant went on to sell nearly 760,000 units over 23 years, becoming one of the most successful European cars of the pre-war era. But André never saw it. Michelin, the tire manufacturer and Citroën's largest creditor, took ownership of the company and ran it from that point forward as something closer to a research laboratory than a traditional car maker. A place where engineers could dream as big as they liked, as long as those dreams eventually resulted in selling more tires. In 1938, the new managing director, Pierre Boulanger, launched 2 secret projects. One was the TPV, which stood for Très Petite Voiture, very small car. That became the legendary 2CV. The other was called the VGD, Vehicle à Grande Diffusion, a high-volume car intended to replace the aging traction Avant by the early 1940s. Boulanger was specific in what he wanted. The new car would be lighter, more aerodynamic, and more comfortable. It would use front-wheel drive but with a fundamentally different suspension system. Metal springs were heavy. They fatigued over time. They could not adapt to changing loads. Boulanger wanted something better. Something that did not yet exist. Then the war arrived and had other plans entirely. During the Nazi occupation of France, which began in May 1940, Citroën's factory was requisitioned to build vehicles for German forces. Boulanger ordered his engineers to hide their notes on the TPV and VGD projects and continue working on them only in secret, away from German oversight. The VGD sat on a shelf in someone's desk drawer, wrapped in whatever obscurity its creators could manage. Then the war ended, France started rebuilding, and Citroën faced a hard decision. The country needed cheap transportation first. People needed to get around. The economy needed to move. The 2CV took priority. The VGD waited and waited. Boulanger himself died in a car accident in 1950, never seeing the project he had commissioned reach completion. His successor, Pierre Berco, picked it up and pushed forward. By the time anything resembling a finished car emerged from that process, the project had been running for nearly 18 years. 18 years from concept to production. That is not a development cycle. That is an obsession. That is also, perhaps, the most French thing that has ever happened in the history of engineering. 3 men shaped what eventually emerged from those 18 years more than anyone else. André Lefebvre was an aeronautical engineer by training, a man who had worked for Voisin Aircraft and raced cars before joining Citroën. He was consumed by the idea that most cars were needlessly heavy and badly shaped. He was right, and he had the aerodynamic data to prove it. Flaminio Bertoni was an Italian sculptor and industrial designer who approached car design the way Michelangelo approached marble. He did not draw the DS on paper first. He sculpted it in clay, working with his hands, shaping curves by instinct and feel. The DS's silhouette did not come from a drafting table or a wind tunnel. It came from an artist's fingertips. And Paul Mages, a self-taught engineer with no formal degree, invented the hydraulic system that would become the car's single greatest triumph and its most persistent commercial headache. Mages was the kind of engineer who approached every problem by asking whether fluid pressure could do what everyone else assumed required metal and friction. The answer, almost always, was yes. The original plan called for a flat 6 engine, air-cooled, horizontally opposed, designed by Walter Becchia. It was essentially 3 of the 2CV's twin-cylinder engines joined together, 1.8 liters of displacement. A French cousin to the Porsche Flat 6 that would come later. On paper, it was perfect. Low, flat, easy to fit beneath that swooping hood without compromising the aerodynamic roofline. In practice, a disaster. Prototypes made no more power than the old traction Avant 4-cylinder, and they were heavier and thirstier. Citroën spent years trying to make it work. By 1954, they gave up. The budget had been consumed by the hydraulic system and the body engineering. So they took the traction Avant's 1,911 cubic centimeter 4-cylinder, gave it an aluminum crossflow head with hemi-combustion chambers, bolted on a twin-barrel Weber carburetor, and moved on. 75 horsepower from a pre-war design, in a car that was supposed to represent everything the future could offer. This is the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Citroën DS. Everything about it was 20 years ahead of its time, except the one thing that made it go. The engine was 20 years behind. But here's the thing. Nobody cared. Not at first. Not even close. Because what surrounded that ancient engine was so far beyond anything in any production car, anywhere in the world, that the horsepower figure barely registered. The story of what was underneath that sculpted body is really where this gets extraordinary. And that's exactly where we're going next. On Thursday, the 6th of October, 1955, the covers came off at the Paris Motor Show under the great vaults of the Grand Palais, and the crowd lost its collective mind. Within 15 minutes, 743 orders had been placed. By end of day, 12,000. By the time the show closed, 80,000 people had put down deposits on a car most of them had only seen for a matter of hours. Now, you might be thinking, well, automotive reveals are always dramatic, there's always buzz around a new model. But understand what was parked around the DS at that show. Every other manufacturer had brought their best work. Chrome everywhere. Tail fins catching the light. Upright windshields and boxy bodies designed around the assumption that a car was fundamentally a box with wheels attached. Body-on-frame construction, drum brakes, leaf springs, mechanical linkages for every function. These were the state of the art in 1955, and they looked exactly like what they were: machines built by people who had been building the same kind of machine for decades. What those 80,000 people were looking at was a car that appeared to have been designed by someone who had never seen another car and decided to begin from first principles. The body was low, wide, and impossibly smooth. No chrome grille, no separate fenders, no visible seams where you expected to find them. The roof was fiberglass, chosen to save weight and lower the center of gravity. The hood was aluminium for identical reasons. The body panels themselves were unstressed, meaning they carried no structural load. They were bolted onto an inner steel structure like skin stretched over a skeleton. You could remove a front fender with basic tools in a matter of minutes without affecting the structural integrity of the car in any way. The rear wheels were partially enclosed by the bodywork, and the rear track was deliberately narrower than the front, giving the DS a tapered, almost teardrop shape when viewed from directly above. Like a raindrop moving through air. Which was, of course, exactly the point. The drag coefficient of the production DS was 0.36. For context, most cars of the period sat somewhere around 0.5 or higher. Even the Porsche 356, a purpose-built sports car shaped by decades of aerodynamic refinement and competition experience, could not match it. Later DS models fitted with faired-in headlamps behind glass covers brought that number down to 0.34. Here is what most people don't realize about that figure. Some modern SUVs, built with the benefit of computational fluid dynamics, supercomputers, full-scale wind tunnels, and 70 years of additional engineering knowledge, still cannot beat a drag coefficient achieved by a French family sedan in 1955. Shaped by a sculptor working in clay. The low drag meant the DS could cruise comfortably at over 90 miles per hour despite that modest 75 horsepower engine. Aerodynamics doing the work the engine simply could not. But the bodywork, remarkable as it was almost secondary, because the real story of the DS lived underneath. And this is where it gets really interesting. Paul Mages's hydraulic system was unlike anything fitted to any production car anywhere in the world before or since. A 7-piston pump, driven by a belt off the engine's camshaft pulley, pressurized a special fluid to approximately 2,500 pounds per square inch. That is 172 bar of pressure. For comparison, a typical car power steering system of the era ran at perhaps 1,500 psi on a good day. Mages was pushing aerospace-grade pressure through a passenger vehicle intended for daily use on public roads. And that pressure did not handle one system, it did not handle two. It ran everything simultaneously. The power steering, which used a hydraulically assisted rack and pinion system with residual pressure maintained on both sides of the piston, meaning the steering responded the absolute instant you moved the wheel. No slack, no play, no dead zone in the center. The sensation for drivers used to conventional steering was startling. One review from the period described it as telepathic. You thought about turning, and the car turned. The brakes, which were disc brakes on all four wheels, with the front discs mounted inboard near the differential, rather than out at the wheel hubs. This was a first for any mass-production car on Earth. Inboard mounting reduced unsprung weight, improved heat dissipation, and kept the braking forces closer to the car's center of gravity. The semi-automatic gearbox, which eliminated the clutch pedal entirely. The driver simply touched a small lever mounted behind the steering wheel to select the next gear position and eased off the accelerator. The hydraulic controller did everything else. Disengage the clutch, move the selector, engage the synchromesh, re-engage the clutch. All of it powered by fluid pressure, all controlled by precision slide valves with clearances measured in single-digit micrometers. To give you a sense of what that means, a human hair is approximately 70 micrometers thick. These components demanded manufacturing tolerances closer to Swiss watchmaking than to anything the automotive industry had previously considered necessary. And then there was the suspension itself. Hydropneumatic. This was Mages's masterpiece, The thing that transformed the DS from a merely impressive car into something that seemed to operate by different physical laws than everything around it. Each wheel had a metal sphere mounted above the suspension strut, roughly the size of a grapefruit, divided internally by a flexible rubber membrane. The upper half of that sphere was filled with pressurized nitrogen gas, the lower half with hydraulic fluid. The gas acted as the spring element, but unlike a conventional metal coil spring, it had nonlinear force deflection characteristics. In plain language, the suspension became progressively stiffer as it compressed. Incredibly soft and compliant over small bumps and surface irregularities, firm enough to handle large impacts without bottoming out. And because the fluid moving between the sphere and the suspension cylinder had to flow through calibrated orifices, the system provided its own damping. No separate shock absorbers required. The sphere was simultaneously the spring and the damper. Height correctors attached to each axle monitored the car's ride height continuously and automatically adjusted the fluid volume to compensate for load changes. Hit a pothole and the gas compressed, absorbing the energy. Add 4 passengers and a full boot, and the system pumped in more fluid, keeping the car at the correct height. The ride height could also be adjusted manually from inside the cabin. A lever with 5 positions allowed the driver to raise the car from approximately 3.5 inches of ground clearance to nearly 11 inches. You could jack the DS up on its own suspension to change a tire and then lower it back down. You could raise it high for farm tracks, river crossings, or unmade roads. You could drive it safely with a tire missing entirely, because the suspension would compensate for the imbalance and keep the car controllable. The result was a ride quality that journalists and owners struggled to put into words. Floating, gliding, a magic carpet, a hovercraft. You could drive across the cratered, potholed, half-repaired roads of rural post-war France at speed, and the passengers in the back would barely feel it. The car simply absorbed everything, quietly, calmly, as if the road surface were someone else's problem entirely. Rolls-Royce was so impressed by what Citroën had built that they eventually licensed the hydropneumatic technology for the Silver Shadow. Let that settle for a moment. The most prestigious car manufacturer in England, a company that had spent decades defining the very concept of refinement, looked at what the French had done and decided they could not do better themselves. So they bought the right to use it. When the maker of the world's most expensive and refined cars decides your suspension technology is beyond their ability to improve upon, you have built something genuinely extraordinary. Now, you might be thinking, all right, this all sounds remarkable in a brochure. But how did it actually work in practice? How did real people get on with a car this complex on real roads every day? And this is where the story becomes considerably more complicated. Because the DS was brilliant and bewildering in equal measure. And the gap between those two qualities often depended entirely on your proximity to someone who understood what was happening underneath the bodywork. The early hydraulic fluid, designated LHS, was vegetable-based, and it had a serious, fundamental, maddening flaw. It absorbed moisture from the atmosphere. The reservoir had to be vented to allow fluid levels to change as it circulated around the system, which meant humid air was continuously entering. Water in a high-pressure hydraulic system causes corrosion. Corrosion in pipes running at 2,500 pounds per square inch causes leaks. And leaks in a system that simultaneously controls your brakes, your steering, your suspension, and your gearbox causes the kind of cascading failures that make insurance adjusters reach for a strong drink. It took Citroën 12 years to properly solve this. In 1967, they introduced LHM, a mineral oil that did not absorb atmospheric moisture. That resolved the corrosion problem definitively. But for the first 12 years of DS production, every owner lived with the knowledge that their car's most critical systems were slowly degrading from the inside. The complexity also created a commercial problem that Citroën never fully resolved. The DS was not a car you could take to any garage on any high street. Your local mechanic, the one who could strip and rebuild a Peugeot 403 blindfolded, would open the bonnet of a DS and go very quiet. The engine itself was familiar enough, that ancient traction Avant 4-cylinder, virtually unchanged since the 1930s. But surrounding it was a labyrinth of high-pressure lines, accumulators, regulators, pressure distributors, and those mysterious metal spheres that looked like they had been borrowed from a submarine. Citroën required special tools, special training, special fluids that could not be mixed or substituted. Only authorized dealers could properly maintain the system. In rural France, those dealers could be an extremely long drive away. If you broke down on a country road with a hydraulic leak, you were stranded. Not inconvenienced, stranded. Until someone with the right training and the right equipment arrived. And if you parked a DS for several hours and the pressure slowly bled off through aging seals, the car would sink to the ground like an animal lying down to sleep. Belly practically touching the road. Start the engine, wait perhaps 90 seconds for the pump to rebuild pressure, and the car would slowly, theatrically, rise back up to its normal ride height. It was one of the most dramatic things you could witness in an ordinary car park. It was also deeply unsettling for anyone who had never seen it before, which in the 1950s and 1960s was effectively everyone. The brakes presented their own learning curve. The DS used a brake pedal approximately the size and shape of a mushroom cap, mounted on the floor and operating not on a pivot but straight down, like a button you pressed with your foot. The hydraulic assistance was so immediate, so powerful, so unlike anything a driver had previously experienced that first-time owners routinely locked all four wheels on their very first emergency stop, even at low speeds. The stopping distances were genuinely phenomenal for the era. Contemporary road tests documented stopping distances from 60 miles per hour that would not embarrass a modern car. But the sensitivity of that system required complete recalibration of the driver's right foot before it felt natural. Some owners never quite got there. Some first test drives ended with a very brief, very firm, very unplanned stop. In the United States, the DS was, commercially speaking, a quiet disaster. 38,000 cars sold over 16 years of trying. American buyers in the late 1950s and through the 1960s expected automatic transmissions, power windows, air conditioning, large displacement engines, and the kind of service network that meant you could get help within 10 miles of wherever you broke down. The DS offered none of these things. Its semi-automatic gearbox confused drivers trained to drop a lever into drive and forget about it. Its brake pedal alarmed people accustomed to a soft, forgiving pedal feel that rewarded coarse inputs. Its hydraulic system defeated every mechanic not specifically trained by Citroën, and Citroën's American dealer network was, at its most charitable, sparse. Parts were scarce. Qualified service was scarcer. And that 75-horsepower engine, tasked with driving a hydraulic pump, a power steering system, self-leveling suspension, and inboard disc brakes all simultaneously, meant that 0 to 60 miles per hour was an adventure lasting somewhere north of 18 seconds. This was a country busily building 300-horsepower muscle cars that did that same exercise in under 8. The DS was showing up to an arms race with a philosophy degree. Back in France, Citroën recognized from relatively early that the price of the DS was strangling its potential. The DS19, as the original car was designated, cost 65% more than the traction Avant it replaced. In a country still feeling the economic aftershocks of 2 decades of war, occupation and reconstruction, that was a gap too wide for a very large portion of the buying public to cross. So in 1957, 2 years after the original launch, Citroën introduced the ID. Same body. Same gorgeous, otherworldly silhouette. Same hydropneumatic suspension providing that magic carpet ride. But no power steering. Conventional hydraulic brakes rather than the fully powered, ultra-sensitive system. A manual 4-speed gearbox with a conventional clutch pedal. An engine detuned slightly to 69 horsepower. And a meaningfully lower price. The ID was for buyers who wanted the look and the experience of that suspension, but either could not afford or simply did not yet trust the full hydraulic commitment of the DS. It worked. The ID sold well and helped Citroën reach buyers the DS19 on its own never could. And look, despite everything, Despite the leaking fluid and the baffled mechanics and the cars that sank overnight in driveways and the American market that never understood it and the warranty claims that piled up in Citroen's accounts department, the DS sold. It sold steadily, year after year, across 20 years of continuous production. Early owners learned the rituals. Check the fluid level every week without fail. Keep a spare can of LHS fluid in the boot. Learn the warning signs. Know what the red stop light on the dashboard meant, because if it illuminated while you were driving, you pulled over immediately. That light meant hydraulic pressure was falling below the minimum threshold, and without pressure you were about to lose your power steering, your suspension control, and eventually your brakes in that sequence. The system was actually engineered to fail in a specific order, a graceful degradation designed to keep the driver in control for as long as possible. Steering assistance went first, which was inconvenient but manageable at low speed. The suspension would then begin to sag. The brakes were protected longest by a pressurized accumulator sphere that held a reserve of hydraulic pressure specifically for emergency stops. The car would get you stopped even after everything else had gone. But the message was clear: ignore the warning systems on a DS, and you were having a very bad day. The owners who loved these cars, and there were many, became amateur hydraulic engineers by sheer necessity and accumulated experience. They could diagnose a failing sphere by the character of the ride over a specific type of bump. They could distinguish between a leaking brake seal and a worn steering valve by the rate at which pressure dropped. They developed an intimacy with the mechanical systems of their car that owners of conventional vehicles never needed and never experienced. Ownership of a DS was not merely transportation. It was a relationship with a machine that demanded engagement, rewarded attention, and punished neglect with a specificity that felt almost personal. And on the 22nd of August 1962, that relationship between the DS and its occupants became the difference between history continuing as it did, and history taking a very different turn entirely. That evening, Charles de Gaulle, President of France, and his wife Yvonne were being driven from the Élysée Palace to Villacoublay Air Base for a flight. Their car was a black DS-19. At approximately 8 o'clock in the evening, as the motorcade passed through the southern Paris suburb of Petit Clamart, gunmen from the organization Army Secrète opened fire from two vehicles positioned to create a kill zone. The OAS were furious about de Gaulle's decision to grant Algeria independence. Over 150 rounds were fired in approximately 45 seconds. 8 bullets struck the bodywork of the presidential DS. 2 tires were destroyed. The rear window exploded inward. Glass rained across the back seat. The driver, Francis Moreau, who had survived a previous assassination attempt on de Gaulle the year before, while at the wheel of the same type of car, did what he had been trained to do. He accelerated. On 2 destroyed tires, with rounds still coming in from both sides, he put his foot down, and the hydropneumatic suspension kept the car level. It did not pull toward the shredded tires. It did not lose its composure. It did not drop to the ground and drag on its rims. It held. Moreau drove straight through the kill zone and delivered the President and Madame de Gaulle to Villacoublay without a scratch on either of them. De Gaulle, 71 years old and 6 feet 5 inches tall, reportedly declined to duck during the attack. His wife Yvonne's primary concern upon arrival was whether the jellied chicken she had packed in the boot had been ruined by the commotion. De Gaulle's comment to his prime minister that evening was characteristically compressed. "They shoot like pigs." He never requested any other make of car again for the remainder of his presidency. Here's what most people don't realize about what happened at Petit Clamart. Any conventional car of that period on 2 blown tires at speed would have become essentially undrivable within seconds. The front end would have dropped. The steering would have loaded up violently toward the punctured side. At the speed Moreau was traveling to escape the kill zone, a conventional car would have left the road. The DS stayed level because the hydropneumatic system compensated for the lost support on 2 corners without the driver having to do anything. It just adapted. The same technology that made French housewives comfortable on country roads absorbed a political assassination attempt and kept a head of state alive. That is not a marketing claim. That is documented history. And that single event, perhaps more than any other, cemented the DS's reputation in France as something beyond an automobile, something closer to a talisman. The car proved itself in an entirely different kind of pressure test too, one that surprised almost everyone who followed motorsport at the time. A heavy luxury saloon powered by 75 horsepower had absolutely no business being competitive in international rallying. Look at the entry lists from the late 1950s and early 1960s, and you will find purpose-built sports cars, lightweight coupes, machines specifically engineered for speed over distance. The DS, on paper, had no place among them. Rallying, however, at the level the DS competed, is not primarily about straight-line speed. It is about maintaining competitive pace over terrible road surfaces for hundreds of miles, across days, without the car's mechanical systems failing. It rewards compliance, durability, and the ability to carry speed through rough sections where conventional suspensions are bouncing uncontrollably, which was, of course, precisely what the hydropneumatic system had been designed for. The DS won the Monte Carlo Rally in 1959 outright. That was its first serious competitive outing at that level. And ID took the European Rally Championship the same year. Pauli Toivonen, the Finnish rally driver, won the 1000 Lakes Rally in a DS19 in 1962, beating purpose-built competition cars on one of the most demanding stages in the world. A Finnish forest route that was essentially a prolonged exercise in controlled chaos over surfaces that would destroy a conventional suspension in the first 50 kilometers. Another Monte Carlo victory came in 1966. On the Moroccan Rally and the London to Sydney Marathon, distances that broke engines and shattered chassis and exhausted crews, the DS kept floating through. Its reliability on rough surfaces was almost unfair in its consistency. The same hydraulic complexity that confounded mechanics in European suburbs was keeping rally crews moving through the Sahara and across Central Asia, when every other car in the field had retired. The DS also had a philosopher writing about it. Roland Barthes included an essay on the Citroen DS in his 1957 book, Mythologies, a collection of cultural observations about post-war French life that became one of the most influential texts in 20th century literary theory. Barthes compared modern cars to Gothic cathedrals, describing both as the supreme creation of an era, conceived with passion by unknown artists, consumed as a purely magical object by a whole population which appropriates them as a purely magical object. The new Citroën, he wrote, had obviously fallen from the sky. It was a superlative object, he said, possessed of the same smoothness, the same luminosity, the same effortlessness of human consumption that one finds in a white winter coat. He was fascinated by the way ordinary people touched it at the motor show, running their hands along its surfaces as if testing whether it was real. He saw in it the beginning of a new relationship between humans and machines, something less about brute mechanical force, and more about the idea that technology could be refined to the point where its workings disappeared entirely from view. Barthes was not wrong. That was exactly what Mages and Lefebvre and Bertoni had been trying to achieve. A car where the technology served the experience without announcing itself, where you simply sat down, started the engine, and found yourself transported by something that seemed to operate by different rules than everything around it. The engineering would handle itself. It would be invisible. You would just float. The DS evolved considerably across its 20-year production life, and tracing that evolution tells you a great deal about both the car's strengths and Citroën's institutional character. The engine, the one genuinely weak element of the original 1955 car, was progressively developed through the production run. The original 1,911 cubic centimeter displacement grew eventually to 2,347 cubic centimeters. Power climbed from the original 75 horsepower to 130 horsepower in the highest state of tune, with the introduction of Bosch D-Jetronic electronic fuel injection on the DS21 EFI from 1969. That last detail deserves a moment's attention. Electronic fuel injection on a mass-market production car in 1969. To give that context, most European manufacturers would not offer electronic fuel injection as a standard feature for another decade. Some American manufacturers took until the mid-1980s. Citroën put it on a French family saloon in 1969 because it gave them the combination of power and emissions management they needed. And because, frankly, doing things before everyone else was simply what Citroën did. The 1967 Series 3 DS introduced what may be the most visually spectacular feature of any production car of its era. Faired-in headlamps concealed behind glass covers in the nose, which rotated to point in the direction the steering wheel indicated. Directional headlights. Headlights that turned with the car. The technology existed, the servo mechanisms to drive it existed, so Citroën fitted it. This feature was so advanced that most manufacturers would not offer anything comparable for another 35 to 40 years. Some modern premium cars today make directional headlights a selling point of their adaptive lighting systems. The DS was doing it in 1967 with electromechanical linkages to the steering rack. It is the kind of detail that makes you sit back and wonder what exactly was happening at Citroën's engineering department in the 1960s. The body itself remained almost architecturally unchanged throughout the production run, a testament to how completely right Bertoni's original sculpture had been. The proportions, the silhouette, the relationship between the greenhouse and the body, these remained essentially as they had been on the 1955 show car. Minor updates came and went. The nose treatment evolved. The interior was progressively modernized. But the fundamental form was untouchable, because the fundamental form was already correct. The drag coefficient did not need improving. The visual statement did not need restating. Some things arrive complete. This is where it gets really interesting. Because the commercial consequences of the DS, the downstream effects of having built something so extraordinary, were quietly devastating for Citroën in ways that took years to fully manifest. The company was so consumed by the DS, so completely defined by it, so committed to maintaining its mechanical complexity and continuous development, that they found themselves functionally unable to develop anything else of significance. For 15 years, from 1955 to 1970, Citroën launched no genuinely clean-sheet new model to fill the enormous gap in their range between the cheap 2CV and the expensive DS. That gap was dominated, profitably and consistently, by the Peugeot 403, the Renault 16, and eventually the Ford Cortina. Sensible, middle-market family cars that generated steady, reliable revenue and built dealer networks and created brand loyalty among buyers who would never have considered spending DS money. Citroën had no answer for these buyers. They tried. Prototype after prototype was developed internally, evaluated, and ultimately rejected. Each was either too expensive to build properly or too ordinary for a company whose institutional identity demanded constant and visible innovation. How do you follow a cathedral? What do you build next that doesn't look like a garden shed by comparison? The DS had created a form of institutional paralysis that Citroën's management was decades from fully understanding, let alone resolving. Every potential replacement or companion model was measured against the standard the DS had set, and the middle-market cars that could actually have kept the company financially stable tended to fail that measurement. The engineers who had built the DS, and the culture those engineers had created, were simply not interested in conventional solutions to conventional problems, which was extraordinary for automotive history and quietly ruinous for automotive accounting. In 1970, Citroën made a decision that was either bold or foolish, depending on how you measure the subsequent decade. They acquired Maserati, the Italian sports car manufacturer. The logic was sound on paper. The DS had always deserved a proper engine. The original flat six plan had failed in the 1950s for budget reasons. Now here was an opportunity to access the kind of sophisticated multi-cylinder engine the DS's hydraulic sophistication had always merited, and to do something genuinely extraordinary with it. The result was the SM, a grand touring car fitted with a Maserati V6 engine in various states of tune, married to an even more refined version of the hydropneumatic suspension and a direct power steering system so precise and immediate that it required its own adjustment period. The SM could cruise at 140 miles per hour in conditions of almost surreal comfort. It was by any objective measure one of the most sophisticated grand touring cars ever offered for sale to the public. It was also ferociously expensive, terrifyingly complex even by DS standards, and in the American market, it ran headlong into new emissions regulations and safety requirements that its 1960s Maserati engine was simply not designed to meet. Then the oil crisis of 1973 arrived. A thirsty Italian-engined French Grand Tourer became the last thing anyone wanted to be seen buying. The SM collapsed commercially. The Maserati acquisition bled money at a rate that alarmed even the most optimistic reading of Citroen's finances. Citroën, already weakened by 15 years of having no profitable mid-range model to generate the steady cash flow that sustains an automotive manufacturer through difficult periods, could not absorb losses at this scale. By 1974, the French government, unwilling to allow a company of such industrial and cultural significance to simply collapse, brokered a merger with Peugeot. The new conglomerate, PSA, had accountants who looked at Citroën's engineering department with an expression that combined awe with profound anxiety. The audacity that had built the DS was also what had nearly destroyed the company that built it. The last DS rolled off the production line at the Quai de Javel factory in Paris on the 24th of April, 1975. 20 years, 2 months, and 18 days after the world had gone quiet at the Grand Palais, total production across those 20 years stood at 1,455,746 cars. Now, you might be thinking, alright, it was an important car, but important cars get made and move on and eventually become collector's items for enthusiasts who know their history. True. But the DS is different. The DS is different because of what it left behind. Because the technology that Paul Mages invented, and that Citroën spent 20 years developing and refining, did not stay at Citroën. It spread. And in spreading it shaped the way every sophisticated car on the road today behaves. Active suspension systems on modern luxury cars, the systems that read the road surface ahead and adjust damping in milliseconds, trace their fundamental operating principle directly to what Mages built in the early 1950s. Mercedes-Benz calls their system active body control. BMW calls theirs dynamic drive. Land Rover calls theirs terrain response. The names differ. The underlying logic, using controlled fluid pressure to actively manage the relationship between a car's body and its wheels in response to changing conditions, is Mages's logic. Self-leveling air suspension, which is now standard equipment on virtually every premium SUV sold anywhere in the world, is a pneumatic descendant of the hydropneumatic principle. The sphere and membrane that Mages designed became the air spring and valve block that every modern Range Rover sits on. Electronic fuel injection, which the DS adopted in 1969 as an early commercial pioneer, became universal across the entire automotive industry within 20 years. Disc brakes on all 4 wheels, which the DS introduced as a production car first in 1955, are now mandatory on every passenger car sold in every regulated market in the world. Directional headlights, which the 1967 DS demonstrated were entirely feasible on a production car, are now marketed as advanced adaptive lighting technology and featured prominently in the press materials of manufacturers who presumably do not realize they are describing 1967. The irony woven through all of this is consistent and a little uncomfortable. Most of these features only succeeded commercially, only became genuinely widespread, after someone else simplified them enough that any competent mechanic could service them. Citroën made the technology work. Everyone else made it practical. Citroën paid for the research and development, bore the warranty claims, absorbed the commercial difficulties, pushed through the early failures, and handed the automotive world a set of proven principles that the rest of the industry then refined and sold back to consumers at enormous profit for the following 50 years. Here's what most people don't realize when they look at a DS today. parked perhaps outside a concours event, painted in some beautiful period color, sitting at exactly the right ride height on those narrow tires beneath those smooth, uninterrupted flanks. They look at it, and they see a historic object, an artifact, something preserved and admired from a respectful distance, a beautiful relic. And the DS is certainly beautiful. Classic and Sports Car magazine polled 20 of the world's most prominent automotive designers, among them Giorgetto Giugiaro and Ian Callum, and asked them to name the most beautiful car ever made. The DS won. Not one of the most beautiful. The most beautiful. In the 1999 Car of the Century competition, which attempted to identify the single most important automobile of the 20th century, the DS finished third, behind only the Ford Model T, which essentially invented mass motorization, and the original Mini, which solved the post-war personal mobility problem with extraordinary efficiency. Think about the company that puts you in. Think about the cars that did not make that top three. Clean, correct examples of the DS now command serious money at auction. Standard saloons in exceptional condition change hands for figures well into six figures. The convertibles, the open-top cars hand-built by Parisian coachbuilder Henri Chaperon, who produced fewer than 2,000 of them across the production run, regularly command prices north of $400,000. There is a record of over $1 million for the finest examples at the most prestigious auctions. These are not vintage curiosities selling to nostalgic collectors. These are assets. Objects that serious buyers with serious resources compete for, because they understand what they represent and what was involved in creating them. And here is where the DS story connects to something larger, something that goes beyond one French car from one French company in one particular decade. The DS represents a specific and recurring pattern in the history of technology. A pattern where someone builds something genuinely, fundamentally better than everything around it, and pays an enormous price for the attempt. The pattern has three movements. First, the creation, driven by engineers or designers or both who are more interested in what is possible than in what is practical. Second, the commercial difficulty, where the gap between what the technology can do and what the market can accommodate creates friction, confusion, failure, and cost. And third, the vindication, which often arrives too late to benefit the people who did the original work, when what they invented becomes so clearly correct that the rest of the world adopts it as standard. Citroën went through all three movements with the DS. They did not survive the second movement intact. But the third movement is still ongoing. Because every time you sit in a modern luxury car and notice how quietly and smoothly it manages the road, every time adaptive suspension reads a bump before you feel it, every time self-leveling geometry keeps your headlights pointed in the right direction around a corner, you are sitting in the long shadow of what Paul Mages built in a Parisian engineering office in the early 1950s. Look, the DS is also a reminder of something less comfortable. Being right is not enough. Being first is not enough. Being better is not enough. You also have to be survivable. The DS was all of those first three things, and it nearly took Citroën down with it. The 15 years of mid-market paralysis, the Maserati acquisition, the SM's commercial failure, the government rescue and forced merger with Peugeot. These were not random misfortunes. They were, in significant part, the institutional consequences of having built something so demanding, so complex, so far ahead of its time that the company that built it could not fully manage the commercial reality of its own creation. The engineers were right. The product was right. The timing was arguably right. The organization around it was not built to survive its own ambition. But here's the thing about the DS that I keep coming back to. Keep coming back to when I think about what it means in the history of automotive engineering. Park a DS next to anything else built in 1955. Anything. A Chevrolet Bel Air, a Ford Fairlane, a Mercedes 220, a Jaguar Mark 7, a Lancia Aurelia. Take the best the world had to offer in that year and line them up next to what Flaminio Bertoni sculpted and what Paul Mages engineered and what André Lefebvre conceived. Then step back, look at them together, and try to argue that those engineers were wrong to try. Try to argue that the sensible thing, the commercially prudent thing, the thing that would have kept the accountants comfortable and the shareholders content, would have produced anything worth talking about 69 years later. You cannot. Because the cars that play it safe, the cars built by the logic of what does the market want right now and can we service it cheaply enough, those cars did their job and disappeared. Nobody is writing about the 1955 Chevrolet Bel Air as the most important automobile of the 20th century. Nobody is paying $400,000 for a well-preserved 1966 Ford Fairlane. Nobody sent a philosopher a Fairlane and asked him to explain what it meant for the relationship between human beings and the machines they build. The Citroen DS was built by people who asked what was possible, and then found out. That answer came with consequences, institutional, commercial, mechanical, and human. It came with leaking fluid and baffled mechanics and warranty claims and a merger nobody wanted. It came with an assassination attempt that it survived when nothing else would have. It came with Monte Carlo victories and Barce essays and 80,000 deposit forms filled out in a single week by people who had seen something and understood, without being able to fully articulate why, that they were looking at the future. The goddess earned her name. And the fact that she needed so much maintenance to remain divine is, when you think about it, exactly the kind of detail that separates the genuinely miraculous from everything that merely works. Total production: 1,455,746 goddesses. Exactly one of them stopped an assassin's bullet and kept a president alive. All of them changed what we expected from an automobile. And the world is still, right now, catching up to what a sculptor and an engineer and an aeronautical dreamer built in Paris in 1955. And there you have it, the Citroën DS. A car so advanced that the only thing more remarkable than what it could do was how long the world took to understand it. If you have ever sat in one, driven one, or fought with that hydraulic system in a cold garage at 11 at night, I want to hear about it in the comments below. And if you made it this far into this video, go ahead and hit subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story we cover every week. Thank you for being here.